The night was heavy with the sound of waves striking against the wooden hulls of ships anchored off the Carolina coast. It was 1714, and the Atlantic stretched endlessly under a pale moon, its silver light broken by the restless tide. Sailors whispered of shadows on the horizon, of a figure who moved through the waters like a ghost. A pirate captain whose name had long been lost, but whose presence remained carved in fear. He was said to command not just a crew, but fate itself, and those who fell into his hands rarely returned to tell their story. That year, 42 prisoners vanished with him, swallowed by the sea, leaving behind nothing but questions that echo to this day. The coast itself was no stranger to legends. Merchants, fishermen, and soldiers alike knew the perils of the waters, but this disappearance was different. It was not just a storm or a shipwreck. It was as though an entire company of souls had been erased from the world in a single night. The whispers began in taverns where rum flowed thick, in candle-lit cabins where sailors nursed wounds and fear alike, and in the streets of coastal towns where mothers prayed for sons who would never return. The name of the pirate captain was spoken only in hushed tones, a man whose eyes were said to burn like embers, whose voice could command loyalty or strike terror in equal measure. On that fateful evening, the wind carried a strange silence between gusts. The prisoners, 42 men taken during raids and battles along the shoreline, were locked deep within the bowels of the pirate's ship. Some were soldiers, others simple traders, and a few unlucky sailors captured in the wrong place, at the wrong time. They had heard the creaking of the deck above, the curses of the crew, and the endless sigh of the ocean, but they did not know what fate awaited them. The ship itself was a monstrous vessel, blackened timbers scarred by cannon fire, sails patched with the remnants of other conquests, its figurehead a serpent twisting into the foam. To see it approach was to witness a nightmare unfolding across the horizon. The captain stood at the bow that night, eyes fixed on the distant lights of the Carolina coast. Some said he sought vengeance. Others believed he was searching for something far more valuable than gold. His crew obeyed without question, men hardened by years of blood and plunder, bound not just by greed but by a strange devotion. There was something about the captain that was not entirely mortal, as though the sea itself had chosen him to walk its surface as a master rather than a victim. When he spoke, even the restless ocean seemed to quiet, listening for commands. As the ship crept closer to shore, the air grew thick with tension. Lanterns swayed, ropes groaned, and the prisoners below felt the shift in movement. One of them whispered a prayer. Another cursed under his breath, but all of them felt the same weight pressing down on their chests, the unshakable dread that they were being carried not to a destination, but into oblivion. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, though the sky remained clear. Sailors glanced uneasily at the horizon, sensing a storm that had no clouds, a warning that had no voice. Yet the captain smiled faintly, as though he alone understood what was coming. Stories later told of ghostly lights flickering upon the waves, of shapes that rose and vanished just beyond the edge of sight. Some said they were spirits of the deep, others claimed they were signals, guiding the captain toward a place no map dared to show. The coast of Carolina was littered with hidden inlets, treacherous shoals, and secret channels known only to those who lived by the blade and the tide. But this night was unlike any other. This was the night 42 men would vanish, and the legend of the pirate captain would become eternal. The prisoners did not sleep. They pressed their ears to the damp wood, listening to the muffled movements above. A few dared to whisper, wondering if rescue might come, if the captain planned to sell them for ransom, or if their bones would soon line the bottom of the sea. But no one knew. All they had was the rhythm of the waves, the creak of the ship, and the growing realization that something far darker than captivity awaited them. The night deepened, and the pirate ship drifted like a shadow across the waters. Far behind them, the faint glow of the Carolina coast flickered like dying embers. The prisoners below deck counted the minutes by the scrape of boots above and the rattle of chains against the hull. It was suffocating, the air heavy with salt, sweat, and dread. Each man clung to the hope that morning might bring salvation, though none could explain how. They did not know that morning would never come for them in the way they imagined. One of the prisoners, a soldier who had fought in the colonial militia, leaned against the timber wall and tried to steady his breathing. His name was Elias, a man hardened by battles on land, but unprepared for the merciless rule of the sea. He whispered to the man beside him, a sailor captured weeks earlier. "They cannot keep us here forever," Elias murmured. The sailor shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. This is no ordinary crew, and he is no ordinary captain. If he wishes us alive, we live. If he does not, the sea will claim us, before the sun rises." His voice was flat, void of hope, as though he had already surrendered his soul. Above deck, the crew prepared for something unseen. They adjusted ropes, whispered to one another, and avoided looking too long at the horizon. The captain remained at the bow, unmoving, his gaze fixed forward. He had spoken few words that night, but when he did, the men listened as though scripture fell from his lips. "The tide will carry us to where we must go," he had told them earlier, "and when it does, no chains shall hold back destiny." None dared ask what he meant. They knew better than to question the one who had led them through storms, battles, and curses, whispered in a dozen tongues. He was not just their commander. He was their fate. By midnight, the ocean began to change. The waves grew smaller, their rhythm unnaturally steady, as though some vast hand calmed the waters. A thick mist rolled across the surface, swallowing the ship in a blanket of silver. Sailors moved more carefully, lanterns swinging like ghostly orbs. The silence was heavy, broken only by the groaning timbers of the ship and the uneasy muttering of men who suddenly felt watched. Some swore they saw shapes moving in the fog, figures walking across the water before vanishing into the dark. But no one spoke of it aloud. Fear was dangerous, and on this ship, fear itself could be fatal. Below deck, the prisoners felt the change, as well. The rocking that had once thrown them from side to side ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness. One man began to shout, demanding to be released, his voice raw with desperation. The door to their cell opened only moments later, and a crewman stepped inside. He carried no weapon, only a torch, its flame burning low in the damp air. His eyes were hollow, his face pale as though drained of life. He looked at the prisoners, without malice, but also without mercy. "Quiet yourselves," he said softly, "for the captain has no use for noise tonight." Then he turned and left, locking the door behind him. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. The fog thickened until the ship seemed to float through nothingness. Men at the rails gripped the wood tightly, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. The lanterns illuminated only a swirling wall of grey. Somewhere in the distance, a low sound echoed. Something between a moan and a howl, carried on the mist. Some thought it was the wind, others whispered it was the dead. The captain raised a hand and instantly the crew fell still, every movement ceasing as though the ship itself had frozen in time. He tilted his head, listening to the sound, and then allowed a faint smile to cross his lips. "We are close," he murmured. The crew obeyed a new set of orders, lowering the sails until the ship drifted slowly forward, guided more by unseen force than by wind. Hours passed in this ghostly silence, time unraveling in the fog. The prisoners huddled together, their minds fraying under the weight of uncertainty. Elias tried to keep his courage, whispering prayers under his breath. But even he felt the cold hand of dread creeping along his spine. The sailor beside him muttered of legends, of Cursed captains who struck bargains with the sea, of men who vanished not by chance, but by design. "They are not taking us to land," he whispered, trembling. "They are taking us to the depths." Suddenly, a sound shattered the stillness, a thundering crack, like a cannon firing, though no enemy ship could be seen. The deck shook violently, sending crew and prisoners alike sprawling. Above, sailors scrambled to hold the rigging as the ship lurched. The fog glowed faintly, as though lit from within, and the sea beneath churned with unnatural fury. Lanterns swung wildly, casting twisted shadows across the sails. The prisoners cried out in terror, some pounding against the walls of their cell, others collapsing in despair. Elias braced himself, certain the ship was about to split apart, yet somehow it held. The captain remained unmoved. He stood tall at the bow, arms spread wide as though welcoming the storm. His eyes glowed faintly in the shifting light, and when he spoke, his voice carried over the chaos with terrifying clarity. "The sea remembers her own," he declared. "Tonight, she claims what is hers." His crew echoed the words like a chant, their voices blending with the roar of the waves. It was not fear that gripped them, it was devotion. They believed utterly in the man before them and in the dark power that seemed to shield their ship from destruction. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fury ceased. The fog pulled back, revealing a stretch of ocean that shimmered unnaturally beneath the moonlight. The water was calm once more, but it glowed faintly blue, as though lit from beneath by countless stars. The prisoners stared in silence, unable to comprehend what they saw. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, like gazing into the eyes of eternity. The sailor beside Elias whispered, "We are no longer in the world we knew." The ship glided forward into this glowing sea, and the captain lowered his arms. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes shone with triumph. Whatever he sought, he had found it. The crew moved with renewed purpose, guiding the vessel deeper into the strange waters, their fear replaced by awe. The prisoners, however, felt only despair. For in that moment they understood, they were not being taken to land, nor to any fate a man might write. They were being carried into legend, into a story from which none would return. And so the night stretched on, filled with whispers and the sound of water against wood, as the pirate captain and his 42 prisoners disappeared further into the unknown. The sea glowed like liquid starlight, an endless expanse of shimmering blue stretching farther than any horizon. The crew stood in hushed reverence, their hardened faces softened by awe, while the prisoners cowered in confusion and dread. None of them, free or captive, had seen such waters before. It was as though the ship had slipped through a door, leaving behind the world of men and entering something older, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous. Above, the moon seemed brighter, impossibly large, casting silver flames across the sails. The air smelled of salt and smoke, but beneath it lingered a sweetness, like blossoms drifting over the tide. It was beautiful, haunting, and wrong. Elias pressed his hand against the timber wall of the cell, feeling the vibrations of the ship as it glided effortlessly forward. He tried to steady his thoughts, but they scattered like gulls before a storm. "This cannot be real," he whispered, his voice trembling. The sailor beside him, his face drawn and eyes hollow, did not answer. He simply stared at the glowing water through a narrow crack in the wood, as if waiting for something to rise from its depths. Another prisoner, a young trader barely in his 20s, broke into a sob. His sound was muffled quickly by the hand of another captive, for none wished to draw the crew's attention now. Silence felt safer, though silence itself was suffocating. Above deck, the captain paced slowly, his boots echoing against the planks. He carried no lantern, for the sea itself cast enough light to guide his steps. His cloak drifted behind him in the still air, and his eyes remained fixed on the strange horizon. The crew did not question him, though many crossed themselves or muttered prayers under their breath. They had sailed with him long enough to know that where he led was seldom safe, yet always certain. He never doubted his path, and so neither did they. For them, the fear had become a kind of faith, binding them to him as tightly as chains bound the prisoners below. A sound rose from the water then, soft at first, like the distant song of whales. It deepened, rolling beneath the hull, vibrating through the ship. The men froze, their eyes darting to the captain. He lifted his hand, signaling silence. The sound grew louder, no longer a song but a chorus, dozens of voices entwined, echoing up from the depths. Some swore it was music, others heard screams. The sea churned faintly, glowing brighter, as though answering the voices that rose from beneath. The captain closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, a look of satisfaction on his face. "They know we are here," he said, barely above a whisper. Yet every man on deck heard him. The prisoners below shuddered as the sound vibrated through their bones. Elias gritted his teeth, trying to resist the dread that threatened to consume him. "It is only the sea," he told himself, though he did not believe it. The young trader whimpered again, curling into himself, while the sailor muttered something Elias could not understand, a prayer perhaps, or a curse. The sound grew so loud that it seemed to press against their chests, forcing the breath from their lungs. Just when they thought they would collapse from the weight of it, the noise ceased. The silence that followed was deeper than before, as though the world itself held its breath. When the captain opened his eyes again, the glow of the sea dimmed, revealing something in the distance. It was not land nor another ship. It was darker, rising from the water in jagged spires that pierced the sky like the teeth of some ancient beast. The crew gasped softly, some crossing themselves again, others gripping the rails as though they might fall into the abyss. The formation was massive, a black silhouette shimmering with the reflection of moonlight. At its base, faint lights flickered, like torches burning in the mist. It was not marked on any chart. Few believed it could exist at all. But the captain's smile widened. "We have arrived," he said. The ship approached slowly, guided by unseen currents. The spires grew taller, sharper, until they loomed overhead like a crown of stone. The faint lights grew brighter, revealing structures carved into the rock itself, arches, stairways, ruins of some forgotten age. The place reeked of ancient power, older than any empire men could recall. The crew whispered among themselves, their voices trembling. Some claimed it was the lost fortress of pirates long dead, where treasures beyond measure were hidden. Others muttered that it was cursed ground, a graveyard for the damned. But the captain silenced them with a glance. "You will see soon enough," he said. The prisoners felt the shift as the ship slowed. Their cell door creaked open and several crewmen entered, weapons drawn. The torchlight flickered across their faces, revealing fear and determination in equal measure. One of them barked an order. "On your feet." The captives hesitated, but the point of a blade quickly persuaded them. Chains clinked as they were, herded out, stumbling onto the deck. The glowing waters and towering spires filled their eyes with dread. Elias lifted his gaze, his jaw tightening. Whatever awaited them here, he knew it was no ransom, no exchange, no mercy. The captain descended from the bow, his boots striking the planks with deliberate steps. He moved among the prisoners, studying each face in turn. His gaze lingered on Elias for a moment, as though seeing something deeper than flesh and bone. Then he turned away, lifting his voice so all could hear. "You have been chosen," he declared, "not as victims, but as witnesses. Tonight, the sea claims what was promised centuries ago, and you shall stand before her as proof." The words meant little to the captives, but to the crew they were gospel. A murmur of approval rippled through them, though many still looked uneasy. The ship drifted closer to the spires until it reached a narrow channel of black water. The cliffs rose on either side, blotting out the stars, funneling them into a passage that seemed carved by no natural force. Strange markings glowed, faintly on the stone walls, symbols unknown to the prisoners, but which some of the crew recognized with fearful glances. They tightened their grips on ropes and weapons, muttering under their breath. Elias caught the fear in their eyes, and it struck him harder than the captain's words. If even the crew was afraid, then what awaited them at the end of this passage must be beyond imagining. The channel opened suddenly into a vast lagoon, its waters still and black as obsidian. At its center rose a massive stone arch, half broken yet immense, its surface carved with more of the glowing symbols. The flickering lights they had seen before burned at its base, torches set in iron braziers that had no right to be burning in such a forsaken place. The lagoon was silent, utterly still, as though time itself had stopped within its borders. The captain's voice rang out again, steady and calm. "Behold the gate of tides," he said. "Here, the world of men ends, and the dominion of the sea begins." The crew fell to one knee, heads bowed in reverence. The prisoners stood frozen, shackled, staring at the arch with wide eyes. Elias felt his throat tighten, his pulse hammering in his ears. He did not understand what this gate was, nor what the captain intended, but he knew with certainty that passing through it meant the end of everything he had ever known. The sailor beside him muttered, "We are lost. God help us, we are lost." The ship drifted to a stop before the arch. The captain raised his hand, and the crew rose, their eyes shining with fervor. He turned toward the prisoners once more, his expression calm, almost kind. "Tonight," he said, "your chains will be broken, not by man, but by the sea herself. She takes what is hers, and in return, she gives eternity." The words echoed across the lagoon, swallowed by the still air, and as the captain spoke, the water beneath the arch began to shimmer, glowing brighter and brighter, until it looked as though a second moon had risen from below. The prisoners gasped, recoiling, but the crew stepped forward, their faces lit with awe. The gate of tides had awakened, and with it, the fate of 42 souls hung in the balance. The lagoon was silent, yet alive with an unseen presence. The water beneath the arch shimmered brighter, casting ghostly light across the ship and painting the prisoners' faces in pale blue fire. None of them spoke, though their eyes screamed with terror. Even the crew, hardened men who had plundered and killed without hesitation, shifted uneasily. They had seen storms tear ships apart, cannons roar like thunder, and men cut down in battle, but this was different. This was not nature. This was something older, something that demanded reverence. The captain stood at the bow, his cloak brushing against the deck, his gaze fixed on the glowing water. His lips moved faintly as though reciting words no one else could hear. He spread his arms, and the glow beneath the arch swelled, rippling outward until the whole lagoon glimmered like glass filled with lightning. The crew bowed their heads instinctively, while the prisoners stumbled backward, chains rattling, their eyes wide in disbelief. Elias clenched his fists, his chest heaving as he tried to understand what he was seeing. He whispered to himself, "This is no place for men." The captain lowered his arms, and the ship lurched forward. Though no sail was raised, no oar dipped into the water. It moved as if drawn by the heartbeat of the sea itself. The arch loomed larger with every moment, its broken stones etched with glowing symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as though alive. Some prisoners cried out prayers, others fell silent, their fear too great to voice. The sailor beside Elias whispered hoarsely, "We should have died in battle. Not here. Not like this." His voice cracked, the words torn between rage and despair. When the ship reached the base of the arch, the waters erupted in a blinding flare. Shapes rose from the surface, not solid, not flesh, but shadows sculpted from light and foam. They circled the ship, their forms twisting into faces that were both human and monstrous, eyes burning with blue fire. Some prisoners screamed, recoiling, against the hull, while others stood frozen, unable to look away. The crew bowed lower, their foreheads nearly touching the deck, whispering words of devotion. One of the shapes drifted closer, hovering just above the water. It leaned toward the deck, its face forming into something almost familiar. Elias gasped. He recognized the features, distorted yet unmistakable. It was a man he had once known, a soldier who had vanished years earlier during a coastal skirmish, his body never found. The ghostly figure opened its mouth, and a sound like rushing water filled the air, a voice carried without words. Elias stumbled back, heart pounding, certain he was staring at a soul claimed long ago by the sea. The captain raised his hand, and the spirits halted, their forms flickering but obedient. His voice was calm, commanding, yet filled with something almost tender. "Guardians of the deep," he said, "the time has come. Tonight, the covenant is fulfilled." The water surged in response, and the prisoners felt the deck tilt beneath their feet. Some fell to their knees, begging for mercy. But the crew showed no pity. Their eyes glistened with fanatic devotion, as though witnessing a prophecy long awaited. The sailor beside Elias snapped, his voice raw with panic. "He's delivering us to them," he shouted, thrashing against his chains. "We are sacrifices." His cry echoed across the deck, and for a brief moment, some of the prisoners stirred with desperate resistance. But the captain turned, his gaze sharp as steel, and the ship fell into silence again. His eyes seemed to pierce through the very souls of the men before him. "Sacrifice," he repeated softly. "No, you are not sacrifices. You are offerings. To give is to live forever." The words chilled Elias more than any blade. They carried a weight of truth, twisted yet undeniable. He felt the hopelessness settle deeper in his bones. Around him, the prisoners looked at one another, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They understood that whatever awaited them would not be a quick death. It would be something stranger, darker, perhaps endless. The ship passed fully beneath the arch, and the glow consumed them all. The world beyond dissolved into nothingness, as though the sea itself had swallowed the horizon. The air grew heavier, the silence absolute. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though time had stopped. Then, with a deafening crash, the waters ahead split open. A chasm yawned wide, plunging deep into the earth, glowing blue from its depths. The ship tilted forward, drawn irresistibly into the abyss. The prisoners screamed, chains rattling, while the crew held fast, their devotion unbroken. The vessel plunged downward, not sinking, but descending, carried by invisible currents into the glowing chasm. Walls of water rose on either side, towering, like glass, holding back the sea as though by will alone. Strange creatures flickered in the depths, serpentine shapes, shadows with too many eyes, figures that drifted like fragments of forgotten nightmares. The prisoners clung to one another, their terror absolute. Elias gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand, though his knees trembled violently. He would not fall. Not yet. The descent lasted what felt like hours, though time lost meaning in that place. Finally, the ship leveled, gliding into a vast cavern hidden beneath the sea. The ceiling stretched high above, glittering with crystals that pulsed faintly with light. Stone pillars rose from the water, carved into grotesque shapes, half human, half beast. At the center of the cavern stood a platform of black stone, broad and flat, surrounded by shallow pools that glowed like molten sapphire. It was a temple, built not by men but by something far older. The ship drifted to the edge of the platform and stopped, as though held by unseen hands. The captain stepped forward, his voice carrying with effortless authority. "We have arrived," he said. "The gate has opened, and the sea welcomes her children." The crew erupted into a chant, their voices echoing through the cavern, mingling with the sound of water dripping from the stones. The prisoners huddled together, their fear palpable, their chains clinking like funeral bells. Crewmen moved quickly, dragging the captives from their cell, forcing them onto the platform. The cold stone burned against their bare feet, and the glow from the pools painted their faces in eerie light. Elias stumbled but forced himself upright, his jaw set, his eyes blazing with defiance. Around him, men wept, cursed or prayed, their voices swallowed by the cavern's vastness. The sailor who had spoken of sacrifice shouted once more, his voice breaking, "We are men, not beasts. You cannot feed us to the sea." But his words were drowned by the crew's relentless chant. The captain raised his hands again, and silence fell instantly. He looked upon the prisoners not with cruelty but with solemnity, as though presiding over a sacred rite. "Tonight," he said, "the covenant is sealed. The sea takes what was promised, and in return, she grants her chosen eternal dominion." He turned his gaze toward the glowing pools, and for the first time his voice trembled, not with fear, but with reverence. "Bear witness," he whispered, "to the power that commands the tides." The waters of the pools began to stir, rippling outward. Shapes rose slowly from their depths, forms neither human nor wholly beast. They were tall, cloaked in flowing strands of seaweed and coral, their faces obscured by masks of shell and bone. Their eyes glowed with the same blue fire that had lit the lagoon, burning with an otherworldly hunger. The prisoners recoiled, but the crew fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the stone. The figures advanced, silent, their movements fluid as the tide. Elias stared at them, his body frozen, his mind screaming. He had fought men, he had faced death. But this was something beyond comprehension. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe, to remain standing even as terror gnawed at his core. The sailor beside him collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably, while the young trader buried his face in his hands. The figures stopped at the edge of the platform, their glowing eyes scanning the captives. One lifted its arm, pointing slowly, deliberately, as though choosing. The captain bowed his head, his voice steady. "Take them," he said. "Fulfill the covenant." The cavern pulsed with an otherworldly light, every crystal in the ceiling throbbing like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. The prisoners stood huddled on the black stone platform, their chains rattling in the silence, their eyes wide with terror. Before them, the figures that had risen from the glowing pools loomed in unnatural stillness. Their forms seemed to bend the air itself, woven of water, bone, and shadow. They watched without speaking, their eyes burning with that same blue fire that had haunted the lagoon above. The crew, kneeling low on the stone, trembled in reverence. The captain stood tall at the center, his cloak brushing the platform, his gaze fixed upon the beings. He did not tremble. He did not kneel. He stood as if he were their equal, or perhaps even their chosen. His voice rang clear through the cavern, steady, certain. "The covenant is upon us. The sea takes what is hers, and in return, she grants dominion." His words echoed across the stone, sinking into the ears of both captives and crew alike. The prisoners flinched, but the crew's eyes glistened with fanatic devotion. One of the towering beings stepped forward. The sound of water dripping from its form echoed like thunder. Its mask of bone tilted downward toward the prisoners, and slowly it lifted an arm, long and skeletal, pointing directly at them. Elias felt his chest seize as that glowing gaze swept over him. His instincts screamed to run, to fight, but the chains on his wrists and ankles held him fast. Around him, men collapsed to their knees, sobbing, praying, begging for mercy, but no mercy came. The creature's gesture was met by the captain's command. "Bring them forward." His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it cut sharper than any blade. Crewmen rose and dragged the prisoners in groups of 3, forcing them toward the edge of the pools. The men resisted, thrashing, shouting, but their struggles were pitiful against the hardened sailors. Elias dug his heels into the stone, refusing to move, until a blow struck his back, sending him stumbling forward with the rest. The smell of the glowing water hit him then, a scent both sweet and rotten, like flowers blooming in a graveyard. The way. First 3 captives were shoved before the towering figures. One prisoner dropped to the ground, screaming that he would not go, clawing at the stone until his fingernails split. Another cursed the captain, spitting at his boots, though his voice cracked with terror. The third simply stood trembling, unable to speak. The bone-masked being lowered its hand, and the water of the pool surged upward, wrapping around the prisoners like living chains. They screamed as the glowing tendrils pulled them in, dragging them beneath the surface. The water rippled once, then stilled, leaving nothing but silence. The crew bowed their heads deeper, chanting in unison, "The sea takes what is hers. The sea takes what is hers." Their voices filled the cavern, rising and falling like waves. The prisoners, now fewer by 3, recoiled in horror. Elias clenched his fists until his knuckles bled, his jaw tight. With rage, he whispered through his teeth, "They are feeding us to the abyss." The sailor beside him nodded weakly, his face pale as bone. "Not feeding, binding," he muttered. "Their souls will never rise again." His words made Elias's stomach twist. He thought of the ghostly faces in the fog, the voices beneath the waves. Perhaps those men had been prisoners once, swallowed. By the same ritual, their souls chained forever to the sea. Another group was dragged forward. This time, one of the prisoners fought so violently that 2 crewmen were nearly pulled into the pool with him. His scream was animal, primal, the sound of a man knowing death was at his throat. But the water rose again, faster this time, wrapping around his chest, his throat, silencing him as it pulled him under. His chains rattled once against the stone, then were gone. The others followed, swallowed whole by the glowing depths. Elias's heart thundered in his chest. He counted the men left, less than 30 now. He forced himself to stand straighter, though his knees shook. If he were to die, he swore he would face it with open eyes. But inside, fear gnawed at him, relentless, consuming. He thought of home, of the coast, of the battles he had fought and survived. None of it mattered now. He was not a soldier here. He was prey. The captain turned then, his eyes sweeping over the remaining prisoners. For a moment his gaze lingered on Elias again, sharp and thoughtful. It was as though he recognized something in him, something worth noticing. But then he looked away, raising his voice once more. "The sea does not take without reason. She chooses. She binds. And those who are taken live forever in her embrace." The words sent shivers through the prisoners. Forever. The thought of endless drowning, of being bound to the depths with no release, was worse than death itself. Some began to plead, offering gold, offering service, offering anything to be spared. The crew ignored them. The captain smiled faintly as though their desperation amused him. "You misunderstand," he said. "This is no punishment, this is ascension." Elias's fury burned hotter. "Ascension?" he spat, his voice raw. "You are murdering them. You are feeding them to monsters." The crew turned sharply toward him, but before they could strike, the captain raised his hand. The cavern fell silent. His eyes met Elias's, and for a long moment he studied him. Then he spoke softly, so softly the words barely carried. "Not murder. Transformation." The next group was dragged forward. As they were pulled beneath the glowing water, Elias saw something shift within the pool. The ripples twisted, and, for an instant he saw faces, distorted, screaming, but also alive. Their eyes glowed faintly, just like the beings that towered over the platform. A horrible realization struck him. These creatures, these guardians, they had once been men, prisoners, perhaps sailors, perhaps warriors, taken, changed, bound forever to serve the sea. His stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. He staggered back, his chains rattling, his breath shallow. Around him, the other prisoners began to panic, thrashing wildly, shouting for deliverance. The crew moved in, striking them down, forcing them back into line. But Elias could not tear his eyes from the pool. He saw the truth now, and it was worse than death. The sea was not consuming them. It was remaking them. The sailor beside him whispered hoarsely, "They will come for us, one by one, until none remain." His eyes were wide with madness. "We will be the next guardians. Our bodies lost, our souls bound. There is no escape." Elias clenched his teeth, rage and terror warring in his chest. "There must be a way," he hissed. "No chain is unbreakable." His voice trembled, but it carried a spark of defiance that the others had lost. He refused to surrender, even if the sea itself rose against him. The captain's gaze found him again, lingering longer this time. There was curiosity in his eyes, perhaps even admiration, but it passed quickly, replaced once more with solemn certainty. He raised his hand, signaling for the next group to be taken. The chanting rose again. "The sea takes what is hers. The sea takes what is hers." The cavern trembled with the voices, with the glow, with the power of the abyss. And one by one, the prisoners were dragged forward, their screams swallowed by the glowing pools, their souls bound forever to the dark beneath the waves. The chanting echoed through the cavern, a relentless tide of voices rising and falling with the shimmer of the glowing pools. Prisoners had been dragged away in groups, their screams swallowed by the waters, their bodies never seen again. The air itself felt thicker now, heavy with salt and despair, as though the cavern feasted on fear. Less than half of the captives remained, their chains clinking nervously as they shifted, pressing closer together like animals cornered by fire. Elias stood among them, his fists clenched so tightly, his nails cut into his palms. He could still see the faces in the water, distorted, but alive, twisted into something no longer human. His mind burned with the horror of it. This was no death. This was worse than death. He looked around at the others, men broken, sobbing, some silent with shock. And he knew most of them had already surrendered inside. Their bodies still stood, but their spirits had fallen. He refused to fall. The captain moved gracefully across the platform, his boots silent against the stone. His eyes glowed faintly in the cavern's light, his expression calm, almost serene. He raised his hand, and the crew fell silent instantly, their chant dying like a wave receding into the sea. He turned toward the towering guardians at the pools, lowering his head in reverence. "The covenant nears its completion," he declared. "The sea claims, and we remain faithful." His voice carried with a solemn power, and the crew answered with a unified murmur of agreement. Another group of prisoners was seized then, 3 men dragged struggling toward the pools. One collapsed halfway, too weak to stand, and was pulled across the stone like a carcass. Another tried to bite the hand of a crewman, only to be struck across the face with the butt of a blade. Their cries echoed through the cavern until the waters rose again, swallowing them into silence. The glow flared, and Elias thought he saw their faces join the others in the depths, their eyes igniting with that cursed fire. He turned away, his stomach churning, rage bubbling hotter within him. Beside him, the sailor who had whispered of sacrifice was trembling violently. His voice cracked as he muttered, "We are lost, all of us. Nothing waits but chains." Elias snapped his head toward him, grabbing his shoulder roughly. "No," he hissed. "Listen to me. We may be chained, but chains can be broken. We are not dead yet. If we stand, if we fight, perhaps some of us can still escape." The sailor's eyes flicked toward him, uncertain, but Elias's defiance lit a faint spark in them. It was fragile, but it was something. The captain's gaze swept over the remaining prisoners, his eyes lingering on Elias again, just as they had before. For a moment, the faintest trace of a smile touched his lips. He saw something in Elias, resistance, perhaps strength. Or perhaps he simply saw the satisfaction of breaking a spirit not yet broken. Whatever it was, he said nothing, only raised his hand once more, signaling for the next group to be taken. Elias's chest heaved as he watched. The crew moved methodically, dragging men like offerings to the abyss. His mind raced. If he did nothing, they would all be taken. If he waited, his turn would come. He had to act, but how? Chains bound his wrists and ankles, and armed sailors surrounded them. Still, a thought gnawed at him. Chains could be broken. He repeated it to himself like a prayer. Chains could be broken. The glowing pools stirred again as more prisoners disappeared beneath the surface. The guardians stood silently, their eyes burning brighter now, as though feeding on the fear and flesh offered to them. Elias felt his resolve harden. He would not be one of them. He would not drown in eternity. The cavern trembled suddenly, a low rumble that shook the crystals overhead and sent ripples racing across the pools. The crew looked up sharply, unease flickering across their faces. For the first time, cracks appeared in their composure. The lead captain, however, remained still, his eyes narrowing. "The sea stirs," he murmured. "She knows the covenant draws close." His voice was calm, but there was tension beneath it. The prisoners, sensing something shift, began to murmur desperately. Some thought it was a sign of rescue, others that the cavern itself would collapse. Elias seized the moment, leaning toward the sailor beside him. "If there is a chance, we take it. Do you understand? Better to die fighting than to be chained forever." The sailor's breath came fast, but he nodded weakly. The faint spark in his eyes grew brighter. Elias turned to another man nearby, whispering urgently, "When the next distraction comes, strike, with chains, with teeth, with anything you have. We may not all live, but some of us must." The man stared at him for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. The cavern rumbled again, louder this time, and one of the glowing pools flared violently, sending sparks of blue light into the air. A few crewmen stumbled back, startled. The guardians raised their heads in unison, their glowing eyes shifting toward the disturbance. The captain spread his arms, his voice rising above the noise. "Do not fear, the sea reveals her power. This is the sign of her glory." His words steadied the crew, but their fear did not vanish. Elias felt his heart race. This was the moment. He stepped forward suddenly, pulling hard against his chains. The iron links strained, cutting into his wrists, but he didn't care. The sailor beside him did the same, thrashing wildly, shouting incoherently. The commotion spread through the prisoners. Some resisted, some collapsed in fear. But enough moved with Elias to draw the crew's attention. Shouts rang out, sailors rushing forward to subdue them. But the chaos had begun. Elias swung his bound wrists with all his strength, the chain striking one of the crewmen across the jaw. The man fell back with a cry, blood spraying across the stone. Another sailor lunged at him, but the sailor beside Elias tackled him with desperate fury, their bodies crashing to the ground. Prisoners surged like a wave, thrashing, clawing, biting, using their chains as weapons. Screams filled the cavern, louder than the chants, louder even than the rumbling of the pools. The guardians turned, their glowing eyes fixed upon the chaos. For a moment they did not move, as if uncertain. The captain, however, raised his voice, booming like thunder. "Hold them! Do not let them defy the covenant!" His crew fought with savage desperation, striking with fists, blades, and boots. Blood smeared across the black stone. Prisoners fell, some cut down instantly, but others fought on with wild, hopeless strength. Elias ducked beneath a swing, slamming his chains into the stomach of a sailor, then driving his shoulder into him. The man toppled into the glowing pool, screaming as the water surged up to claim him. His cry was cut short, his body dragged beneath the surface. Elias gasped, his chest heaving, sweat and blood stinging his eyes. He turned to see others fighting, some falling, some striking blows of their own. For the first time, the balance had shifted. The captain strode forward, his eyes blazing, his voice shaking with fury. "You dare defy the sea?" he roared. His words cracked like a whip, and for a moment even the chaos stilled. He looked directly at Elias, his gaze burning like fire. "You," he hissed, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You are the spark. You will be the first to burn." Elias felt the weight of those words, but he did not flinch. His chest rose and fell, his chains dripping with blood. He met the captain's gaze with defiance, his voice hoarse but steady. Better to burn than to drown in chains. The cavern shook violently then, the glowing pools erupting in blinding light. The guardians stepped forward at last, their massive forms looming over the platform. The prisoners and crew alike froze, staring as the waters boiled and the stone itself cracked beneath their feet. The sea had awakened fully, and her judgment was at hand. The cavern roared with chaos as the glowing pools erupted, waves of light surging like fire beneath water. Prisoners screamed, crewmen shouted, and the massive guardians stepped forward, their towering forms shaking the stone with each movement. Elias stood among the storm, his chest heaving, chains dripping with blood. His eyes burned with defiance, even as fear gnawed at his bones. Around him, the rebellion raged. Prisoners swinging chains like whips, sailors striking back with blades and fists, men falling on all sides as the cavern became a slaughterhouse. One of the guardians raised its skeletal arm, and the glowing water obeyed. Tendrils of liquid shot across the platform, wrapping around two prisoners and dragging them screaming into the pool. Their cries were cut short as their bodies vanished beneath the glow, leaving only ripples behind. The other captives froze in terror, their revolt faltering. But Elias shouted, his voice raw, desperate, "Fight! Do not let them take you!" His words cut through the fear, rekindling the madness of resistance. A sailor lunged at Elias, blade raised high. Elias twisted, swinging his bound wrists with brutal force. The chain struck the sailor's temple, dropping him instantly. Blood sprayed across the black stone. Elias seized the fallen blade, its handle slick in his grip. The weight felt foreign in his chained hands, but it was a weapon. Finally, a weapon. He turned, slashing wildly as another crewman advanced. The steel met flesh, and the man fell screaming to the ground. The captain's voice thundered over the chaos, commanding, relentless, "Hold them! The covenant must not be broken." His crew rallied at his words, surging with renewed fury. But for the first time, they faced men who would rather die than surrender. Prisoners lunged like cornered wolves, dragging sailors into the glowing pools, biting, clawing, striking with every ounce of strength left in their battered bodies. The cavern trembled violently again, crystals raining from the ceiling, shattering on the stone below. The pools boiled, glowing brighter with every life taken, until their light painted every face in ghastly blue. Elias stumbled, nearly blinded, but forced himself forward. He could see it, the Guardian's feeding growing stronger with every sacrifice. This was not just ritual, this was hunger, and if it continued, none of them would escape. A hand grabbed his shoulder from behind. Elias spun, slashing with the blade, and the sailor who had stood beside him earlier cried out, barely avoiding the strike. His face was pale, streaked with blood, but his eyes burned with the same desperate fire. "Elias!" he shouted over. "The chaos! The chains! Break them!" He lifted his wrists, the iron cutting deep into his flesh. "We can't fight bound like this." Elias nodded sharply. He raised his sword and brought it down hard on the links. Sparks flew as steel clashed against iron once, twice, until at last the chain snapped. The sailor gasped in shock, his wrists free, blood dripping from the torn skin. His eyes widened with something like hope. Without hesitation, he snatched a fallen dagger and turned on the nearest crewman, driving the blade deep into his chest. Others saw. Others followed. Prisoners began smashing their chains against the stone, against weapons, against each other's bonds. Slowly, painfully, iron links began to shatter. With each one that broke, another man rose free, another weapon was seized. Another sailor fell, the tide was turning. The captain saw it too. His face darkened with fury, his voice rising like thunder. "No!" he bellowed, striding forward, his cloak billowing like smoke. His blade flashed from its sheath, a curved weapon black as night. With a single swing, he cut down 2 prisoners at once, their bodies collapsing lifeless to the stone. The crew roared at his display, their spirits rising again. But Elias did not falter. He raised his stolen blade, his voice cutting across the cavern. "He bleeds like any man. Take him and the sea's spell breaks." The captain's eyes snapped to him, cold and burning all at once. "You presume much, soldier," he hissed, "but the sea does not bleed." He advanced, his steps measured, his presence radiating power. Around him the Guardians stirred, their burning eyes fixed upon Elias. It was as though the sea itself had marked him. Elias braced himself, though his arms trembled with exhaustion. The captain was no ordinary foe. His movements too precise, too controlled, like a predator who had hunted 1,000 times before. But Elias felt no choice. If he was to die, he would die standing, blade in hand. The first clash came like thunder. Steel met steel, sparks scattering across the stone. The captain's strength was monstrous, his strikes heavy and deliberate, each one meant to end the fight in a single blow. Elias staggered beneath the force, his arms screaming with pain. But he held on. Again and again he parried, barely surviving each strike, his body moving on instinct alone. Around them, the battle raged. Prisoners screamed as Guardians dragged more into the glowing pools. Crewmen fell beneath freed chains and stolen blades, the cavern itself quaking as though it would collapse. The pools boiled higher, their light blinding, their hunger insatiable. Yet still Elias fought, each clash of steel echoing through the chaos, each strike a defiance against the abyss. The captain pressed forward, his face a mask of fury. "You cannot win," he growled, slamming Elias back with another crushing blow. "You are but flesh. I am eternal." His blade swept low, cutting through Elias's side, blood spraying. Across the stone, Elias cried out, stumbling, his vision swimming. The captain raised his weapon for the final strike, but Elias did not fall. He tightened his grip, teeth gritted, eyes blazing with defiance. Even the sea breaks on the rocks, he rasped. With a desperate surge of strength, he swung upward, his blade catching the captain's arm. Blood erupted, crimson against the blue glow. For the first time, the captain staggered, his eyes wide with shock. He bled. The prisoners saw. They roared as one, their cries echoing like thunder. Hope surged through them, wild and burning. They hurled themselves at the crew, at the guardians, at the abyss itself. The cavern shook with their fury, with the clash of steel and chains, with the defiance of men who refused to be swallowed whole. The captain stared at his wound, blood dripping down his arm. His gaze lifted to Elias, burning with rage, and something darker, fear. He bared his teeth, his voice a snarl. "You have doomed them all." He raised his blade once more, and the cavern erupted in blinding light. The blinding light seared through the cavern, a wave of brilliance so fierce that both prisoners and crew threw up their arms to shield their eyes. The pools boiled violently, sending sprays of glowing water across the black stone. The guardians loomed taller than before, their forms rippling as though the sea itself were pouring through them. Their burning eyes locked on the captain and Elias, the duel that had shaken even the abyss. The captain's wound dripped steadily, crimson staining his black coat. For the first time, he looked less like an untouchable phantom and more like a man of flesh. Yet the fury in his gaze burned brighter than the wound could weaken. He advanced with renewed ferocity, his curved blade flashing in arcs that hissed through the damp air. Elias staggered back, blocking, parrying every strike, rattling his bones, his own blade slick with blood. His wound burned with each breath, but he forced himself forward, teeth bared. He could not falter now. Too many lives hung on his defiance. Around them, chaos erupted into frenzy. Freed prisoners, chains snapped and weapons seized, surged against the crew. Their desperation turned savage. Men fought not for survival alone, but for vengeance. A prisoner swung a broken chain around a sailor's neck, pulling until bone cracked. Another drove a stolen blade deep into a pirate's chest, screaming until his voice broke. Blood slicked the stone, screams echoed against the cavern walls, and the pools swallowed more bodies without mercy. The guardians moved with terrible grace, their massive arms sweeping through the air. Tendrils of glowing water lashed outward, striking down rebels, dragging them screaming into the depths. One prisoner was lifted entirely off the ground, thrashing as the liquid wrapped around his throat and wrists before being flung into the pool like a toy. His scream ended in a splash and silence, yet even this horror could not quell the revolt completely. Elias's strike against the captain had lit a fire that refused to die. The sailor who had fought beside him earlier appeared at his side now, a dagger dripping in his hand, his face streaked with blood and sweat. "Elias," he shouted over the din, "we must end him, the captain. The crew follows him, not the sea. Break him and they'll falter." His eyes burned with desperation, but also with grim determination. Elias nodded, his chest heaving. He already knew the truth. The captain was the keystone, the heart of this nightmare. As long as he stood, the Covenant held power. The captain snarled, hearing their words as if the cavern itself carried them to his ears. "You think me mortal," his voice thundered, carrying over every scream and clash of steel. "I am chosen. The sea flows through my veins. My will is her will." He slashed downward, his blade carving a deep gash into the stone where Elias had stood only a heartbeat before. Sparks flew, and the cavern shook as though it had felt the strike itself. Elias rolled across the ground, rising with grim resolve. "Chosen or not," he spat, his voice hoarse, "you bleed like any man." He lunged, driving his sword toward the captain's chest. But the captain moved with inhuman speed, deflecting the blow and countering with a slash that ripped across Elias's arm. Pain seared through him, but he refused to fall. Their blades clashed again, ringing like bells of doom, echoing through the cavern as if even the abyss listened. The guardians stirred closer, their massive forms circling as though drawn to the clash of wills. Their eyes flared brighter, their tendrils writhing. It was as if the outcome of this duel would decide not just the fate of the prisoners, but the covenant itself. The pools bubbled violently, their glow threatening to engulf the entire chamber. All around, the battle reached its height. Crewmen fought with savage loyalty, but their strength began to wane under the relentless fury of men who refused to bow. Prisoners screamed as they struck down their oppressors, some falling immediately after, cut down by another blade or dragged into the pools. The cavern floor was a sea of blood, bodies and broken chains. The sailor fighting near Elias lunged at a crewman who had raised his blade to strike. Their bodies collided, and the sailor drove his dagger into the pirate's chest. But before he could pull it free, a tendril of glowing water lashed out, seizing him by the waist. He screamed Elias's name as he was yanked toward the pool. Elias spun, reaching desperately, but the sailor's body vanished beneath the glowing surface, his cries silenced. Elias froze, his heart shattering with fury and grief. His ally, his spark of hope gone in an instant. The captain laughed, a sound like thunder breaking. "The sea takes what is hers." His voice echoed, a chant in itself, and some of his crew repeated it desperately, clinging to their faith. Elias turned back to him, eyes blazing with rage. "Then she will take you too," he roared, charging forward with every ounce of strength he had left. Their blades met again, steel screaming against steel. The captain struck hard, relentless, but Elias met him blow for blow, his muscles burning, his blood soaking the stone. Sparks flew with every clash, their faces inches apart, teeth bared, eyes locked in hatred. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The cavern, the battle, the pools, all blurred into the background. There was only the clash of steel and the will of two men, one defiant, the other eternal. The captain pressed forward, forcing Elias back to the very edge of a glowing pool. The heat of it burned against his skin, the light blinding. One misstep, and he would be dragged beneath, lost forever. The captain's lips curled in a cruel smile. "You will drown screaming, and the sea will remember your defiance only as fuel for her hunger." His blade swept upward, poised for the final strike. But Elias ducked low, twisting with desperate instinct. His chain-wrapped wrists slammed against the captain's wounded arm, reopening the gash. The captain roared in pain, staggering back. Elias surged upward, his sword driving forward with all the fury, all the grief, all the unbreakable defiance, burning in his soul. The blade pierced flesh, sinking deep into the captain's side. The cavern erupted in chaos. The guardians shrieked, a sound like wails and thunder colliding, their forms convulsing violently. The pools boiled over, waves of glowing water spilling across the stone. Crewmen screamed in horror, some dropping their weapons, others fleeing blindly. The captain staggered, blood pouring freely now, his eyes wide with shock. He clutched the buoy. "Wound," his voice a broken rasp. "The covenant cannot break." Elias wrenched his blade free, his own body trembling, his vision swimming with exhaustion. He stood over the captain, chest heaving, blood dripping from every wound. His voice cracked as he spat the words, "It already has." The captain fell. To his knees, his blade clattering to the stone, his eyes dimmed, the burning fire fading at last. For the first time he looked human, broken, mortal, dying. With a final gasp, he toppled into the glowing pool behind him. The water swallowed him whole, flaring violently as though the sea itself screamed in rage. Then, slowly, the glow began to fade. The guardians shuddered, their towering forms flickering like dying embers. One by one, they collapsed into the pools, dissolving into the water until nothing remained. The prisoners and crew alike froze, staring in awe and terror. The pools boiled once more, then fell still, their light dimming too. Nothing but a faint shimmer. The cavern was plunged into shadow, the only sound the ragged breaths of the living. Elias stood trembling, his blade slick with blood, his chest burning with pain. Around him, the surviving prisoners stared, their chains broken, their eyes wide, with disbelief. The captain was gone, the guardians were gone, the covenant was broken. For the first time in what felt like eternity, silence filled the cavern. The cavern lay in silence, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the ragged breaths of the survivors. The once blinding glow of the pools had faded to a faint shimmer, their light now no brighter than dying embers in the dark. The guardians were gone, dissolved into nothing. The captain had vanished beneath the surface, his final scream swallowed whole by the abyss. For a moment it seemed as though the sea itself had retreated, leaving only ruin in its wake. Elias stood trembling, blood seeping from half a dozen wounds, his sword still clutched in a shaking hand. He stared at the pools, expecting them to flare again, to drag him under as they had so many others. But they remained still, eerily still, like mirrors reflecting only the broken men who lingered at their edges. Slowly, painfully, he let the blade drop to the stone. The clang echoed across the cavern, sharp in the quiet, like a bell tolling for the dead. Around him, the prisoners, no, the survivors, shifted uncertainly. Their chains were broken, their eyes hollow, their bodies bruised and bloodied. Some knelt on the stone, staring blankly at the pools where their comrades had vanished. Others clutched stolen weapons with white knuckles, their hands trembling too much to release them. No one spoke. The silence pressed down heavier than the chanting had, as though they all waited for the sea to take back what little mercy it had given. At last, one man coughed, his voice rough and broken. Is it over?" His question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered. Elias wanted to say yes, wanted to believe it, but he could not. He had seen too much of the sea's hunger to trust silence. His chest heaved as he forced the words out. "We cannot stay. We must find a way. Out before it returns." The survivors stirred, their fear shifting into urgency. The sailor who had been dragged away moments before was gone, lost to the pools, but Elias thought of him now. His voice still echoed in his mind. Break the chains. He had, and it had saved them. At least some of them. Elias turned, scanning the cavern for any path that might lead out. The entrance they had come through was gone, sealed by collapse or swallowed by the sea. But far above, faint lines of moonlight spilled through cracks in the stone. The surface was there, waiting. "We climb," Elias rasped, pointing toward the light. His voice carried authority now, not as a soldier among equals, but as a man who had faced the abyss and lived. "We climb, or we die here." The men hesitated, their bodies broken, their spirits fragile. But slowly, one by one, they nodded. Better to climb toward hope than wait for the pools to awaken again. Elias led them to the base of the cavern wall, jagged stone rising toward the cracks of light. The climb was treacherous, the rocks slick with seawater, the air heavy with salt. Bloodied hands slipped, chains rattled loose from wrists, men cursed and gasped as they pulled themselves upward. Each step was agony, but each step was also defiance. Halfway up, one man lost his grip. His scream cut through the darkness as he plummeted back to the stone floor. His body hit with a sickening crack, and the survivors froze, staring down. The pools shimmered faintly at the sound, ripples spreading across their surface. Elias shouted up to them, his voice raw. "Do not. Stop, keep climbing, do not look back!" His own arms trembled violently, his wounds screaming with every pull, but he forced himself higher, higher, toward the promise of air. The climb seemed endless. The cracks of moonlight grew brighter, wider, until at last, Elias's hand found an opening. He pulled himself through, gasping as cool night air hit his face. He staggered out onto a narrow ledge, the Carolina coast stretching before him. Waves crashed against jagged rocks far below, the sea endless and black under the moon. The air was sharp, cold, but it was freedom. One by one, the survivors crawled out beside him, collapsing against the stone, their chests heaving. They looked out at the horizon with wide eyes, as though afraid it might vanish. Elias stood unsteadily, his body trembling, and scanned the shoreline. In the distance, wreckage floated, the remains of ships dragged into the pools and spat out again by the sea's fury. Among the debris, smaller boats bobbed, abandoned but intact. Hope flickered in his chest. "Down there," he said, pointing toward the wreckage. "If we can reach the boats, we can leave this place." The men groaned at the thought of climbing again, but Elias's voice carried them forward. They descended the cliff with painstaking care, clinging to rocks, sliding, down slopes, bruising themselves further but never stopping. At last, their feet touched sand, wet and cold beneath their torn boots. The surf hissed at their ankles, a constant reminder of the sea's presence. Elias glanced back toward the cavern above. The cracks of light glowed faintly, but no sound came from within. Perhaps the covenant truly was broken. Or perhaps the sea was only waiting. The survivors reached the boats, shoving them free of debris, their strength nearly spent. Elias climbed into one, gripping the oars with hands that bled, and began to row. Others followed suit, and soon the boats pushed through the surf, rising and falling with the tide. The coast faded behind them, the cavern vanishing into shadow. The sea stretched out before them, vast and endless. For a time, they rowed in silence, the only sound the splash of oars and the cry of gulls overhead. Then one man whispered, his voice trembling, Do you think we are free?" Elias stared out at the horizon, the moon's reflection broken by the waves. He thought of the captain's final words. "The covenant cannot break." He thought of the faces in the pools glowing, watching. He thought of the sailor dragged beneath the surface, his scream echoing still in his ears. Slowly he shook his head. "We are alive," he said at last, his voice hoarse but steady. "That is enough for now." The others bowed their heads, accepting the answer. They rode on into the night, their bodies broken but their spirits clinging to the fragile thread of survival. Behind them, the sea whispered softly against the shore, as though laughing, or promising that the story was not yet over. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, in the silence where no light reached, the pools stirred faintly once more. The sea stretched endlessly, black and glistening beneath the silver gaze of the moon. The small boats rocked gently on the waves, carrying men who had been chained in darkness only hours before. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gaunt, their hands blistered from the oars. Yet in their silence, there was something new, something fragile. Not hope, not yet, but the faint possibility of it. The air tasted different here, clean and sharp, nothing like the heavy dampness of the cavern. For the first time, they could breathe without feeling the weight of the abyss pressing against their lungs. Elias sat at the head of one of the boats, his hands raw, his arms trembling with exhaustion. Every stroke of the oar sent fire through his wounds, but he did not stop. The others followed his rhythm, their movements uneven, but enough to keep the boat moving forward. He lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the faint glow of dawn brushed the edge of the world. After endless nights in chains, the sight of that light seemed almost unreal. But the silence weighed heavy. No one spoke of what they had seen, of the captain's laughter, of the glowing pools that had devoured men whole. Words felt dangerous, as though saying them aloud would summon the abyss once more. They rode in silence, every creak of wood, every splash of oar, a reminder that they were still alive and that life was fragile. At last, as the sun climbed higher, land came into view. The coastline stretched out, wild and untamed, with forests rising behind long stretches of pale sand. The men gasped softly, some crossing themselves, others bowing their heads in disbelief. For so long they had seen only stone and firelight. Now the sight of trees swaying in the wind was like a vision of paradise. The boat scraped against the sand, and the men stumbled ashore, collapsing onto the beach. They lay sprawled in the surf, letting the waves wash over them, too weak to rise. Elias staggered forward, his legs nearly buckling, and dropped to his knees in the sand. He dug his fingers into it, feeling the solid, unmoving earth beneath him. For the first time in what felt like eternity, he was not surrounded by water. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the forest wash over him, the rustle of leaves, the cry of distant birds. It was almost enough to make him believe they had escaped. But the sea never forgets. As the men rested, Elias turned back toward the horizon. The waves glittered in the sunlight, calm now, deceptively calm. No sign remained of the cavern, no trace of the glowing pools. Yet he could not shake the memory of the captain's final words. The covenant cannot break. What if his death had not ended it but only changed it? What if the sea had marked them all, binding them to its hunger forever? One of the survivors, a younger man with a shattered look in his eyes, crawled closer. His voice was hoarse, a whisper carried on the wind. "What happens now, Elias? Do we go home? Do we speak of this?" His hands shook as he clutched at the sand, as though afraid it might vanish. Elias looked at him, then at the others scattered across the beach. They were broken men, scarred beyond healing, but alive. If they told the world what they had seen, who would believe them? Tales of glowing pools and seaborne guardians would be dismissed as madness, drunken fantasies spun by sailors. Yet silence meant burying the truth, leaving the sea's secret to fester in the dark. "We survive," Elias said finally, his voice steady though his soul wavered. "We do not speak of it here. Not yet. The world is not ready for what we have seen." The younger man nodded weakly, though his eyes filled with tears. He pressed his forehead to the sand as though in prayer. Elias rose slowly, swaying with weakness, and faced the forest beyond the beach. It stretched endless and wild, but it was land that could be walked, land that could be claimed. He knew their journey was far from over. Hunger, sickness, and the threat of discovery still loomed ahead. But compared to the cavern, compared to the abyss, these were battles they could fight. Still, as the sun climbed higher and the men began to gather their strength, Elias's mind would not rest. He could still hear the captain's laughter in his dreams, still see the moment when the pools boiled and the guardians shrieked. He could still feel the water's pull against his skin, as though it had marked him, claimed him in ways he could not yet understand. That night, when the survivors built a fire from driftwood and huddled around it, Elias could not sleep. He sat staring out at the sea, its surface calm under the stars. The others slept fitfully, muttering in their dreams, their faces twisted in fear. Elias alone kept watch, his hand resting on the hilt of the blade he had carried from the cavern. Its steel was dull now, chipped and stained, but it was the only proof he had that their ordeal had been real. The waves lapped gently against the shore, a soothing rhythm that belied their hunger. Elias narrowed his eyes, certain he had seen something, a flicker of light beneath the surface, faint and fleeting, like the pools but smaller, hidden. His chest tightened, breath catching in his throat. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the endless black sea. Perhaps it had been nothing, only the trick of moonlight on water. Or perhaps it was a reminder. The sea does not forget. The sea does not forgive. Elias gripped the blade tighter. His jaw set. He would not speak of it to the others. Not yet. They needed peace, even if it was fragile. But in his heart, he knew the truth. The covenant had not ended with the captain's fall. It had only shifted, seeking another vessel, another story. When dawn came, the survivors would walk into the forests, searching for food, for shelter, for a chance to rebuild their lives. They would scatter, some perhaps finding villages, others vanishing into the wild. They would carry their scars in silence, burying the memory of the cavern deep within themselves. To the world, they would be sailors who had survived a wreck, nothing more. But Elias would never forget. He would carry the sea's mark with him until his last breath. And someday, somewhere, when the tides turned and the sea hungered again, he feared he would hear that laughter once more, for the sea is eternal and men are only its prey.